And we are about to have also Composer here with us. So for that, I would like to welcome on stage Nils Adermann, the co-creator of Composer and Packagist. Please give a warm welcome to him.
How are you, Nils?
Thank you. Great. Excited for this.
Feels really good to have you here. Obviously, you have created one of the most important pieces in the PHP history, I would say. Yesterday, I actually made you a lot of questions about Composer, but today I wanted to share a little bit of Composer with the audience today. So yeah, the stage is yours.
Thanks so much. Yeah, and I think we can talk about the history of it all, but I think so many things have happened just in the last couple of weeks.
100%.
And I think that's what I'm going to be talking about today mostly.
It kind of seemed like it was all planned just to have a very good talk at PHPverse. I guess that's not the case, but you were busy.
Yeah, no, I think it just changed the focus for this talk a bit very recently. So I think I do want to talk about very current topics instead of the things that have happened over the last couple of years. And that's why I also kind of somewhat last minute changed the title of this presentation to Composer and Packagist, Supply Chain Security in 2026. And we published this blog post, I think it's like nearly 3 weeks ago now, that kind of outlined a bit like what our thinking had already been for the last several years, especially the last year, that we just didn't communicate a whole lot about. Like here and there, and you could maybe spot a few things in individual GitHub issues. And I think we figured or decided that we just need to communicate this a bit more publicly and openly, just so that there's a bit of a better understanding in the PHP ecosystem around what we are doing already. And yeah, what made this so important, and I mean, I keep saying about the last couple of weeks, but let's make sure the audience actually knows what we're talking about. And I think what really happened and changed is that the threat to PHP developers shifted, changed, materialized more practically in the last couple of weeks. And I think there were two particular incidents that happened that I want to highlight as they kind of showed a change or were very relevant. And the first one was end of April. Somebody managed to get access to Intercom's SDK for PHP repository, along with their various other repositories they had. And they published malicious code that would steal credentials, that tries to get all your cloud access, your GitHub account, etc., from your machine if you install it or run the code in there. And similarly, a couple of weeks later, May 22nd, the Laravel project got attacked in the same way, where one of the employees of the company that helps maintain this had their account, their machine taken over so that they could access the GitHub repository underneath those packages. And then they uploaded in various new tags, credential stealers, that people who would try to install this had their credentials stolen. Now, what changed a bit and why is this different? Why did this happen a long time ago? And there's a number of things that go in here. If you've been following supply chain security for a while, then you know that this has been a topic for at least the last 2 to 3 years, increasingly. A lot of the big news have been in the NPM and PyPI ecosystems. And so that's, I think, how a lot of this access still happens today. It's either PHP developers that also have JavaScript projects that run NPM, that run some Python project, that run an AI agent locally that decides to install some random Python library to quickly do this one thing they asked it to do without actually going through proper verification of what is it that I'm installing off the internet right now. And I think also new is an increasing number of attacks on IDE plugins. VS Code has been in the news for this a bit, where people realize if I get access to a developer's IDE, I really get access to everything that they can do. And so GitHub account takeover used to be sort of the hard part. So we would used to say Composer is relatively in a good place because the way that you publish something to packages.org is by taking over a GitHub repository. And that's a lot more difficult than stealing somebody's NPM or PyPI token. And that's not true anymore because NPM and PyPI have been working on making their part more secure. And so especially with OIDC, trusted publishing, build attestations, mechanisms that they've put in place to kind of get to the same level of source code ties directly to artifact that somebody installs. They have kind of closed that gap on their side. And it means that now, similarly to with Composer and Packagist, the way that you publish something is you gain access to a GitHub repository. And you can do that either by taking over somebody's machine through whichever random other thing that person installed, or through GitHub Actions. And another focus has increasingly been GitHub Action security. People don't really understand the security model of GitHub Actions. And a lot of people run GitHub Actions with tokens that allow write access. And then if you have GitHub Actions that somehow work on third-party pull requests, it's pretty easy to slip in some malicious code and access the underlying repository. So yeah, like the number of attacks keeps increasing, and I think the success of these attacks attracts more attackers to try and do the same kind of thing, and that's why we're seeing these more frequently, more of them, and in worse scenarios. And it's really, I think, forcing everybody in software, not just in the PHP ecosystem, to reevaluate how and what they want to protect. Because in the end now, like one single compromised GitHub account can spread malware to so many places. Because like if it's like self-replicating, like a lot of these instances, once you hit one developer, they publish the malware, which in turn then gets to any other developer who can publish malware, and so on and so on. So yeah, we decided to do something about this, and to understand that a bit, just how does this work in the Composer context? Like I said, you get access to a GitHub repo. Typically with Composer, the way that you publish is by simply making a tag on the Git repository. And then packages.org just records the URL pointing at the GitHub API. In more than 99% of cases, open source packages and packages.org are on GitHub. That dynamically generates a zip file from that source code. And that's like the neat thing with the advantage we have is where the download, the artifact is directly generated from the source code. So unlike other ecosystems where you have to generate some artifact and then upload it, and then there's the question and problem of like, how does that artifact relate back to the source code? And was that maybe published by an attacker and not by the actual source repository? We don't have that problem, but we still have the problem that if somebody has access to the repository, it's all just as broken. And on the flip side, one of the downsides is because these are dynamically generated by GitHub, they are not stable. So you can't check some of the artifacts. You can't do any signatures on these because they can actually change over time. And Composer will simply then download from this GitHub API URL that's recorded in the log file. And on the positive side, the log file pins the exact commit behind a tag. So it's really Composer updates requires that are easy to attack, but unless you really review a log file in depth or use like tooling like private packages update review to really spot these changes, it's very easy to slip by you that you didn't change the version, but the underlying Git commit changed. And so part of our blog post was a bit, and I want to walk through this today, is like, what have we done today? What's in place as additional protections and mechanisms, and what's coming? And what we already have shipped with Composer 2.10 is we have this Aikido malware feed that gets ingested into packages.org. Aikido is a software supply chain security company that both automatically and then with some human review tries to review for malware every single package and version published on packages.org. And then there's like a pretty rapid manual response system set up where we try to delete this stuff in response to those reports. And they also now automatically publish a list that Composer directly gets access to stop you from installing the malware as soon as they flagged it, and even before we have a chance to review this and actually pull the particular releases. We already implemented a public transparency log last year. I'll go into the details of that a bit later. We implemented Zizmore, which is a static analysis tool for GitHub Actions across all of the Composer and Packagist repositories that we run, and we're really recommending that anybody maintaining open source packages and PHP ecosystem set this up. Then there's GitHub configuration that you can do. I know Nuno did his GitHub moat thing, and I think Fabian talked about a great thing earlier, like just using Terraform to automate the configuration of your GitHub repositories if you manage quite a few of them. Make sure that you allow list third-party GitHub actions so some PR can't add new GitHub actions, or default your workflows to read-only so they can't manipulate repositories. Yeah, like what we've shipped in the last 2 weeks already is dependency policy definition, Composer 2.10, that simplifies the configuration around this. Stable version immutability on packages.org, so people can't modify tags after the fact on packages.org anymore. We deprecated source fallback, which was a mechanism, again, I'll go through it in a little more detail on all of these. There was a mechanism that would go back from, if you can't download the zip file, it would just check out from the repository. So mechanisms that would protect the zip file would actually get circumvented in the failure case by the git checkout underneath. And what we'll still be shipping soon is a minimum release age flag or cooldown mechanism, multi-factor authentication that will show up, or multi-factor authentication state will show up in the transparency log and on individual maintainer profiles publicly for people to judge the security posture of open source libraries they depend on. We will implement organizational package ownership, bulk package management for these organizations, and additional security controls that you can use as an organization. And then more longer term, we're going to look at implementing stage release publishing, where you have to actually confirm manually that you are a human present for a release. Again, referring back a bit to what Fabien was describing earlier, with an MFA approval to go through with a release. We're going to add more secure mechanisms like FIDO2 to our MFA mechanisms that are currently supported on Packagist. We'll make MFA mandatory. We want to host the actual artifacts in an immutable way rather than referencing GitHub API URLs on Packagist.org. We want to introduce build provenance and trusted publishing that we know from NPM and PyPI. And then we also want to implement additional dependency policies, including provenance policies. So you can kind of set on the Composer client side that you want to verify that everything that you install was built on a public GitHub action, for example. Let's look at these in a bit more detail. So today, detection response is mostly still, it's somewhat automated now. There's like about a bunch of manual stuff in place. So Aikido is already automatically publishing this feed that we built into Packagist.org under a free license, which is super helpful. And so Composer can ingest that directly. We also get some manual reports from Socket, another one of these companies that tries to analyze new versions as they're published, that we have to just react to. And we're open to more providers of this kind of data, integrating with them if they want to make this data available under a free license that we can redistribute easily. And then we have to, manually pull versions quickly, sometimes in the middle of the night, which obviously is a bit of a, like our ops part is also getting more difficult and stressful in having to react and deal with these situations. But we're trying to now focus a bit more on prevention rather than just reaction. And that's where we're going with this. But that's so far, I think this is, in these incidents that I've described, helped us prevent the worst, where we've been able to pull these things within a few minutes. The more catastrophic outcomes we were able to prevent so far. I mentioned the transparency log, and what this is about is basically recording all the details around a public package. So ownership or maintainer changes are recorded, and they're publicly for anybody to see. Any versions that are being published, deleted, flagged in some way. If somebody tries to tag the underlying Git repository, you will actually see a note there that the tag is now pointing at a different commit than what was actually published. It'll record account events for the maintainer. So you can see if some maintainer account actually had their email reset. And eventually here you will also see whether or not they have MFA enabled, so that you can draw conclusions about the security of a particular dependency. The work on this was funded by the German Sovereign Tech Agency. We want to thank you through the PHP Foundation. It's great to kind of see these types of investments help us actually implement all of this on top of all the operational work that we already have to do. This already enabled us to just build exact timelines in the incidents that we've had so far, of figuring out what exactly happened at what point and to really understand the incident. So it's also a great analytical tool. But I think most importantly, it really makes it possible for anyone to audit the behavior and security of packages based on various signals. And so we're also interested in anybody who wants to build monitoring on top of this, because we want to provide an API for this, but we'd love to be in touch with more people that actually have ideas for tooling that want to build on top of this to get this API design right. So feel free to open a GitHub issue, email me. We'd love to talk to you if that's something that you want to build tooling for. Dependency polys in Composer 2.10 are part of it. Is just that we now have 3 categories already that are built into Composer of kind of problematic packages. So we have the security advisory support that's been around for a while. We've gotten this new idea of like versions flagged as potential malware. Then we have abandoned packages where the maintainers are no longer looking after them. And so now we have a standardized configuration framework where you can define the behavior for each of these types of problems with packages, and you can also define custom policies that work based on either additional lists of packages that you publish under a URL, or you can define a post endpoint HTTP base that will get a list of the packages you're about to install, and then that can draw its own conclusions. So there's also very extensible where you can build additional security tooling for Composer and for that ecosystem. The defaults are kind of what most projects want. So, malware gets blocked on update and on install, even from the log file, so that this thing does not end up on your machine. With advisories, we block it on an update, so you can't update to an insecure version, but it's still installable because often enough that particular code path, maybe it doesn't affect your your application, and you don't want to deploy to stop working just because somebody said there's one code path that's vulnerable. So you have time to analyze and assess this. And for abandoned packages, this currently only gives you a warning if you run Composer audit on your project. And then PHPverse accompanies a bunch of these new features with tooling for organizations that we can't build into Composer directly. So, for example, allows you to enforce this across an entire organization. So, because Composer obviously has to have flags to configure this to disable certain behavior. If you want, as a big company, to have the same rules enforced for everybody, or if you care that your AI agents can't just decide to autonomously go, oh, look, I can't install this version of a package, I want to just overwrite that with the ignore malware flag, which exists for good reasons, but then you also have a mechanism to do this with something like PHPverse. Yeah, I mentioned minimum release age. Basically, the idea is just, it's very common in other package managers too now, that you just have a period of waiting between when something is released and until you install it, so that all these automated tools that are analyzing packages have a chance to do so and have a chance to pull malware. The problem that we have right now is that the metadata on packages.org, it can still be controlled by an attacker because it's all based on pulling data in from Git. Historically, like the date time for a release of a version is pulled from that Git tag. But you can, of course, force push to a GitHub repository a date time that is a year in the past. And so until we have fixed that part on packages.org and changed how the publication process there works to allow us to do that, we don't want to provide this minimum release age option, which would technically be circumvented very trivially, and then kind of give people this false sense of security that's not actually there. It actually recently came out that Dependabot does very much that thing, where you can specify a cooldown in Dependabot, but the cooldown is based on data that attackers can control, so it does not actually protect you. So if you currently think that Dependabot is safe because you configured a cooldown, do revisit that decision and kind of think about how that's coming about. So minimum release age or cooldown, whatever you want to call it, is coming. We're just not quite there yet because we do have to make those changes on the infrastructure side on packages.org first to make this actually make sense. I mentioned the source fallback mechanism, and here's like an example of what you'll actually find if you look at the log file. So in the log file for most packages, you will find a source and a dist reference. The dist is kind of the artifact, the zip version, the quick to download version of that particular instance, and source gives you where does the Git repository for this package live. And then they'll both have a reference for that particular commit. And historically, Composer was more thinking about availability. So if the zip download would, for any reason, error, it would just go back to the source download. But now if we have a mechanism where we want to disable the download for a particular zip file because we determine there's malware in there, and Composer then just goes back to the Git repository and pulls it anyway, obviously that's circumventing anything we can do on the artifact. And so this is now just disabled. You can, of course, still install from source with Composer. If that's something you intentionally do and you want to do that from the source repository, you just have to pick whether you want the dist artifact mechanism or the source mechanism. And so, yeah, by default in 2.10, it's disabled, but there is still a flag to turn it back on if somehow you have some kind of process that depends on this fallback mechanism. There is a GitHub issue I'm referencing here that some people have reported such situations in. So far, we've always been able to explain to them that there's a different way of configuring the same workflow, and then it works fine. But yeah, please do report there if you have some particular workflow that we have just not seen before. People do tend to come up with very creative solutions to problems we didn't think were problems. So yeah, before we remove the setting entirely, please let us know if you do rely on it. And yeah, similar to before with private packages, you can also just strip source URLs entirely from all third-party mirrored packages, meaning if you, as an organization, you want to make sure that nobody ever falls back to source installs, you can just strip the whole thing. And then you no longer have to rely on people updating to Composer 2.10 in your company, and you just get this behavior. I mentioned stable versions are now immutable, and here's a screenshot from our transparency log that actually records now version reference change blocked. This is just a random sample I took, and it's just a couple minutes, and there's they're just rolling in. So many people retag. We've been telling people for years, do not change Git tags. It's a really bad practice, because by the time that, like, people often do this because they think, oh, I pushed out a mistake in my release and it's only been out for like 3 minutes and I noticed. I'm going to quickly fix it and I'm going to just change the tag and nobody will notice. But the reality is so many automatic systems react immediately that once you've pushed the tag, it's out there. And the only thing you're doing by retagging is you're not helping anybody. You're just making it extremely confusing, because now no user can understand or know whether they had the original broken version or the new fixed version. And also, if you're doing that, you break their trust, because now they will just install the thing thinking they get the same thing, but they get slightly modified behavior, and they don't necessarily know how and why this behavior was changed. And you'd want to review like a changelog and see, hey, what bug fixes are there actually? And this weird bug fix just showed up from like in the same version, which just depending on which server you ran the Composer install on at what time is different. So just don't retag. And packagist.org now just rejects these. So like the versions on packagist.org remain stable, and you can't do this on Packagist anymore. Of course, this is not true for dev versions that track branches, because those are by intention, like very intentionally immutable. Because if I have like a def my feature package and it references a Git branch, then of course that thing needs to move. But for any stable version, you can't change them anymore. And it is all logged in the transparency log for reference. We want to implement stage publishing for releases, meaning we want to first, we don't want to change the mechanism at the first stage. So we'll still pull from a GitHub repository, and then it'll simply not show up as a version for the first step. And then we want to have verification steps. So that means we can have an MFA acceptance step. We can wait for something like Aikido to actually scan the package. And then once all the verifications that you have configured or that we have configured are completed, we will actually publish the version and make it available for installation with Composer. This is something that NPM actually just shipped, I think 2 weeks ago, staged publishing. Because they similarly had this problem that because so many people managed to take over GitHub Actions and just do releases from there, even though they implemented OIDC and build attestations, that they still want to have this additional factor to releases. It's also tricky because, of course, we still want to have dev versions that we just talked about, that immutable branches that change all the time, that can't go through this flow because that wouldn't work. And so like figuring out the exact boundaries on this and security mechanisms is still a bit of work. We talked about MFA already. I think that's one of the steps where we're a bit behind the others. I think partially because it didn't matter so much. Like the access to packages.org doesn't get you much. You can change the URL for a package, but that's blocked if you have more than 50,000 installs on your package. And so then there's really nothing you can do with that account. But if we start doing things like verifying releases with MFA through packages.org accounts, then we really have to work on that. So we're trying to push forward a timeline on making MFA required, of publishing it on transparency log, and really making that public information, I think, is important, so that you can really take a look at, do the maintainers of the libraries I depend on actually have secure practices, or do I want to reevaluate if I even want to use that package? And we have had cases a few years ago already of maintainers of a Doctrine package, I think, having their account taken over because they hadn't logged in years, and they had a really old password that was leaked in some database somewhere, and they never set up MFA. And so that kind of thing really needs to be protected. So if you do maintain anything on packages.org and you don't have MFA configured yet, do it now. Like, just basically leave this open in another tab, go fix it and come back. Then we're working on organizational package ownership, just to allow people to manage large groups of packages more effectively than that is the case today. To manage a whole, like we talked about Symfony earlier with their 300 packages, having some controls where you can change the maintainers of those 300 packages without having to click through this in the UI 300 times. It's funded by the Sovereign Tech Agency, again, or the PHP Foundation. And it is also a basis for a lot of other things on the roadmap. So for example, how would you do the multi-stage release process with MFA if you have to do this individually for 300 packages? Of course, you need some kind of like, okay, I'm bulk releasing things here, and I need to just verify this once. We want to, like I mentioned, start hosting the immutable artifacts on packages.org itself. So that means we want to generate the zip files once. We want to store them on packages.org. And initially, we were a bit worried about doing this before we've implemented other mechanisms, so like built attestations, trusted publishing. But I think we're at a point where the benefit of having, well, if they're immutable and we have the transparency log and we get other people to follow that, then if we don't allow people to upload anything to packages.org, we're still pulling it from the underlying source repository. The immutability of the artifact itself is going to gain us so much more that we might start doing that sooner than we implement the rest of this. And yeah, so that's, I think, where we're coming around a bit to maybe changing the timeline and order of these projects a bit. But we will not allow uploads until we have a mechanism where basically we don't become a potential problem in the chain. Because if we were to allow people to upload packages to packages.org, anybody who could access packages.org can manipulate these files, and there's no other mechanisms to verify that we haven't tampered with them. So that's something a situation we don't want to be in. And that's something that others like NPM and PyPI have been fighting to get away from for years. So we don't want to get ourselves into that problem. So as long as we can do that with the necessary security precautions, we'd like to go there eventually. So yeah, the other parts to that are, and I've mentioned this a couple of times now without really explaining what it is, built provenance and verification. There's a SALSA standard for provenance, meaning it's basically a description of the environment in which an artifact is built. So you can easily generate this on GitHub Actions, where you basically get a list of like, okay, this is the GitHub action with the following workflow name in this repository on GitHub, and I got the GitHub OIDC provider to verify that like I am actually that workflow right now. And I get metadata over like, okay, what are the containers that I'm running this on? And then this is all signed with a temporary identity provided by GitHub to the GitHub action. And then later on, if you're using Composer client-side, you can install the package and it can verify that this thing was actually built from the, like on a GitHub action, the zip file was generated from the actual source code in that particular GitHub repository, and it was signed at the time by that GitHub action. And it wasn't produced on some attacker's local machine and then pushed to our servers using some token that they've compromised. So that's a bit the gist of what build provenance is all about, is, you know, verifiable way of telling, okay, where did this artifact come from and how was it built? And so the 210, like Composer 210 policy framework kind of already tries to go in this direction, building up the setup to allow us to add such configuration because it's more flexible. We can add more types of policies. And so this is already in preparation of this future work. And there are a couple of standards this targets, but the OpenSSF and SALSA, you can look at these if you're a bit more interested in details. I'm not going to go to that, but this is long-term work. NPM already shipped signed provenance in 23 and PyPI attestations in 24, which were the things that I mentioned in the first slide. Kind of shifting a bit their security model to similar to what we have today. But if we do want to go the other way around now, we also need to implement these. And yeah, it goes together with trusted publishing, which is just this mechanism of like, how do you actually upload an artifact to the repository? And you don't do that with some long-lived API token or something of the sort that could get leaked, that could get stolen, but you do it by configuring on both sides the identity of the corresponding service, so that GitHub knows about packages.org and packages.org knows about the GitHub action, and they basically just talk to each other, exchange short-lived temporary tokens, and then you can upload the file temporarily just for that one package that is tied to that one particular GitHub action. And that way, there's just nothing you can leak or lose. Like you just don't have a credential in the first place. And this has already been, again, adopted in a bunch of other places like PyPI, RubyGems, Crates.io, NuGet, etc. And if we do want to allow uploads to packages.org, that's something we're going to have to build. And that will allow us to keep the same strong like source code artifact tie that we have today, despite allowing the uploads. Yeah, I mentioned this a couple times throughout the talk, but basically we're also simultaneously working on private packages, just being the tool that we offer to kind of take this further than we can with the open source project, because obviously the open source tool is like a CLI, and then we have the free service. But then as a business, you really should have kind of an internal package registry that's mirroring these, not sitting in between your individual end users and the registry. And so that's what private packages does. There are alternatives, but I think is that the thing that's funding Composer and Packagist development? We're trying to make sure that this all lines up with things that we can offer there. And that's, what we have today is we can disable the disk mirroring fallback for third-party repositories, the source fallback that I mentioned earlier, by just stripping source URL. So this also works even on all older Composer versions. You have a mechanism now to require everybody in your company to use an up-to-date Composer version. So it simply rejects requests that come from older Composer versions. So that you basically force a random AI agent that just decides to install something to also use a current version of Composer. And then even the malware blocking, etc., that's only shipped in Composer 2.10 will just happen on this repository side. And so then you can configure how you want that to behave, and then the clients are all safe. And what we're still shipping this week is a plugin allow list. So that's something Composer allows, where you can configure which plugins are actually allowed to execute code at install time with Composer. And we'll make it so that you can do this on the repository side, and again, independent of the individual configuration in a project and not overridable. So yeah, I think this is really, from our perspective, the way that you should use Composer and Packagist in any business environment. But yeah, let's talk about, on the flip side, because I already mentioned that we're funding Packagist Composer development. Let's talk a bit about the infrastructure of Packagist. Here's some numbers, stats. So we're hosting 450,000 packages. There's 4 billion installs a month. That means there's about 4,800 requests a second on average, right? There's like peaks that are significantly higher than this. And we transfer about 50 terabytes of data a month. And you got to keep in mind, this is just for the metadata, right? We're not actually hosting any of the artifacts. This is just the JSON metadata, and most of this is like 304s, not modified HTTP responses. We definitely noticed growth since earlier this year. I do think that AI is a bit of a driver in this without being really certain or being able to say that for sure. We swapped out the CDN last summer. We use Bunny's CDN now instead of like kind of this homegrown multi-region OVH setup we built ourselves over the years. Because back when we started on this like 10 years ago, it was still a bit more tricky to have something that changes this much on a CDN, because like we said, we talked about the dev branches, dev versions tracking branches that change, very mutable, change very frequently. And back then it was kind of difficult to do that on a CDN. That's super easy today. And so we finally made the switch last year. And we already planned for distributing the artifacts, but we'll obviously significantly change the math here on the bandwidth requirements. And at the core of this is AWS. We use EC2, RDS, Elasticache, Redis. It's like a little redundant setup that handles all the GitHub webhooks we get, pulls the data in, generates the metadata that then gets pushed out to the CDN. Mostly it's interacting with GitHub, like I mentioned a few times already. And we'd really love to invest more in like the hardening of the security and this infrastructure. I mean, we do some of that, but there's definitely a lot more that we could do. The last third-party infrastructure audit happened 2 years ago now, funded by Alpha Omega at the Linux Foundation, and that's definitely something we'd also like to do on a regular basis, which takes us a bit to the financial side of all of this. And so I think our current math is that this year we're probably going to spend about $1 million or slightly over $1 million to just kind of run what's there and to kind of do what we're doing and maintain it all. And what's important is also to understand that this is to a large part to pay staff. Like infrastructure makes up maybe a third of that. But the thing is, we were just talking about like having to deal with malware in the middle of the night, having to keep a service up 24/7 that everybody relies on. And like we want to make MFA mandatory. You know how many people forget their MFA token on a given day already? And so the costs here are going to definitely increase, mostly on the staffing side. And that's not something we can fix by getting more free servers offered by various infrastructure companies in the PHP space. That's something we need more financial support for in terms of actual finances. And so we're launching a new formalized sponsorship program later this month. And yeah, if you are working for a company that can help us fund some of this work and that can actually help us get to the 1.3 million we've listed here to really implement a lot of what we talked about on the road ahead, instead of just a few small bits and pieces, which would require us to even get more staff, to have more maybe freelancers help without some of those work on short notice, then please contact us. Please help us sponsor this work. And at the same time, there is a cross-ecosystem movement through the OpenSSF, where we've published 2 joint letters with other package registries that all face similar sustainability problems, where we're basically trying to explain that we will have to make sure that every large corporate user, consumer of these registries financially participates in their operation. And so we will try to find ways to really reach out to more people to, in a sense, kind of encourage, if not to say force, more people to actually financially participate in that. But for the moment, it would just already help us a lot if we got a few more sponsors on board. So yeah, really hoping that some people will also just reach out from their side who we haven't thought about yet. So yeah, leaving of that, just what can you do today? If you maintain packages, enable MFA, move off shared accounts, stop. We're gonna do those organizational controls. Already start setting up individual user accounts. Upgrade Composer 2.10, of course, and please install Sysmore in all GitHub actions so that you have control over the security of your GitHub actions. If you, if you're a business, if you depend on Composer and Packagist, if you ship an SDK for your paid SaaS or run an open core business on packages that we distribute for you, sponsor us. And if you consume from packagist.org, ease the load on our free service by actually having implemented caching correctly on your CI, by using an internal private Composer repository like Private Packagist. Again, upgrade to Composer 2.10 and don't use old versions that cause a lot more strain on our infrastructure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nils. That was absolutely fantastic. Everyone clapping for Nils. I loved it. And, in behalf of the entire PHP ecosystem, I just want to say thank you. And I think everyone at home agrees with this. Like, I actually feel hope for the future just because we have so much people very mindful about security in the PHP ecosystem.
And I want to add to that, what I really appreciated over the past few weeks is how transparent Packagist was communicating about all of this. And that's just, of course, we're dealing with new things and some things went wrong, but it's just, we're in this together and working towards a solution together. And that's really great. So I really appreciate that communication. You mentioned that would have been a problem in the past, like not being super clear about what was going on in this area. But now I feel like, wow.
I think there's two parts of that. Like one is I'm also super happy on the other side with the reaction of the PHP ecosystem that are just kind of happily communicating with us about these issues, and they're not being aggressive towards us, but actually very helpful. So that's kind of nice to experience. And then the other part is more that our assumption over the last 2-3 years that we've really been looking at this and already working on some of the underlying parts was always that people don't really seem to care. And so we didn't communicate as much about it as we have recently, just because people didn't seem that interested. It wasn't that we wouldn't want to. It's just more of a, I guess it's like a niche interest, and it changed very much from a niche interest to like everybody has this on their minds. And I think that's actually a good thing that we've gotten to this point where it's not just a few security experts in the PHP field, but it's actually something that everybody is thinking about and is making decisions about. And I'm really glad that that's happening.
100%. And I was just walking through the chat while you were speaking, and the entire community was saying how awesome Composer is. So, by the way, chat, everyone typing W Composer just because of that. I think everyone loves Composer at this moment. And I want to make you a quick question on this topic. You mentioned Composer 2.10 as being a big release in terms of security. For those who are a little bit distracted, how they can have this latest version locally?
You just run Composer self-update.
-- self-update, right? Oh,
just Composer space self-update.
Self-update.
Or even no dash. Like, there's like 5 different aliases. So like no matter how you type it, it'll be right.
Okay, you also mentioned something really interesting. I actually got shocked. And let me know if I'm incorrect here, but you mentioned something like 5K requests per second. Is that right?
That's right.
That's insane. So for those who are not actually companies, but individuals who wish to contribute financially to the Composer and Packagist project, how can they do it? Do you have something like GitHub sponsors?
We do, but honestly, if you want to contribute as an individual, I think there's greater places. I think the PHP Foundation with their open collective setup, that's a great place to help sponsor as an individual. I think we're really focused on like packages should be free for the individual freelance users that are like what we care about is the large corporate users that are making millions or even billions in profits on top of the PHP ecosystem and very much rely on our service being available, and they should very much contribute to the infrastructure and our operation of it.
Well, Nils, thank you so much. Everyone clapping for Nils, please.